Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Thanks, John, and good morning to everyone. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview with Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing program that explores research and publications of leading academics in the international security community, as well as our own JSOU faculty, resident senior fellows, and the global SOCT community. The online collection of Think JSOU webinars includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings posted to the Strategic Studies Department page through our library, the All Partner Access Network, or APAN, and JSOU social media sites. As we go through the presentation today, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and the moderator will forward them to me, and I will recognize you by name for your question, or you can ask it anonymously. Our guest today is Kevin Bilms. He is a career Department of Defense civilian serving in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. Prior to this assignment, Kevin served as a senior policy analyst for counterterrorism and transnational threats at the National Security Council. Kevin, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today at Think JSOU. Kevin, I'm going to start out by telling kind of the story about how you got here today. I, like many in SOCOM and many in JSOU, were forwarded the recent article that you wrote that appeared on the War on the Rocks webpage. I read that article and immediately I thought to myself, what is this guy doing? What is he trying to do? We'll talk a little bit about your article in a second, but kind of truth in marketing, we've never met each other before. I read your article. I thought it was interesting. And sometimes people write articles, but they don't get that good feedback. So I reached out and contacted you, invited you to come to Think JSOU. Can you start out by telling us a little bit more about your background and what other writing you do before we get into this particular article?
Yeah, Doug. So as you mentioned, I'm in OSD policy serving under ASD SOLIC. I'm a career DoD civilian, predominantly focused to date on counterterrorism until this current assignment. In this current assignment, we're looking at irregular warfare policy for the department, and there are a few key questions that we kind of banter and grapple with on a day-to-day basis. Just for framing the discussion, those are topics like how does SOF contribute in an era of great power competition? What role does irregular warfare have in great power competition for SOF as well as for conventional forces, because there is applicability for the conventional force as well. And how does irregular warfare as a type of warfare and as a skill set fit into a whole of government approach to competition? These are highly relevant questions, not just for DoD, but for the entire government and society writ large. I know a number of people are thinking about those on a regular basis. And I think about that as well in my free time when I write articles like this and some other ones over the last couple of years. My intent anytime I try to write sometimes is to help me better understand or come to terms with one of these issues. Sometimes similar to this one for War on the Rocks is to start the wider discussion. So I'm very happy that it seems like that has worked and that we're here today to talk about it.
So in the article, which I'll let you introduce, you have I think a unique format or style that drew me in. It was listed on a web page, but lots of links. I received it through a group that I'm in on LinkedIn. And so you start by giving kind of a generalized theory or idea, and then you back it up by walking through, I think it's 7 points. So to start out with, You propose that irregular warfare has an image problem. So tell us the title of the article and how you set up the initial point.
Yeah, so I do think that irregular warfare has an image problem, both from people who practice it as well as people who look at it from the outside. Kind of two-part reason to that. I think first, IW has become conflated over the last 20 years as meaning soft-centric, kinetic, direct action approaches for counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. Some of that has been exacerbated by Hollywood depictions, but I think some of that has also just been that that's the most readily available case study of IW over the last 20 years. On the other hand, as people talk about the need to compete and reorient towards great power competition, this misunderstanding causes planners, policymakers, academics to overlook or potentially neglect the role that other activities associated with irregular warfare can have in competition and potentially outsized impact. So as I was playing with those ideas and thinking that there is a form of disconnect, I was wondering if playing with the terminology could help. And as you mentioned, I took the 5 core activities and missions of irregular warfare along with some of the enabling activities and came to that 7 new terms or ways of thinking about them.
Do you think that in the article, you actually make the case that irregular warfare is misunderstood? Why do you think that is the case? And what do you think this kind of comes from?
Yeah, I think that comes from some of the conflating IW with counterterrorism with COIN, thinking that only SOFT can conduct IW, and that IW is a thing of the past as we get into an era of great power competition against near-peer states. This is a theme that features prominently in the Irregular Warfare Annex to the National Defense Strategy, which in my day job I helped to oversee and implement. But it also reverberates as well through the wider National Defense Strategy that points out that there are a range of activities that our adversaries take, in part because they know that we maintain conventional overmatch as a means to erode our advantages and try to secure their objectives at our expense. And I think that that's a little tragic because I think irregular warfare is a tool set that is well attuned to their approaches and can provide significant impact.
So in the session today, we probably have close to 100 people. A lot of them have come in because they either are in special operations or they're interested in irregular warfare. Your idea is to rename some of the missions to better describe their functions. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think that would make it easier for those who are unfamiliar with this space, the special operations community in particular. It would help outsiders better understand what all is represented by irregular warfare, not just counterterrorism, not just COIN, and also help to refocus those activities with an eye towards competition against near-peer states. At the same time, it could help practitioners kind of divest themselves from a lot of the jargon that we're very familiar with and look at the activities, the underlying missions and operations through a different lens that could potentially be more relevant for today's competitive landscape.
So just a reminder to our audience, as we continue with our conversation, at any time you have any sort of questions or points you'd like to have presented to Kevin, please write them in the Q&A section, and our moderator, John, will forward them to me to ask to Kevin. So what I would propose now, Kevin, is let's walk through some of your basic points. The first of which is, let's change unconventional warfare to support to resistance. Why that differentiation?
Yeah, so I started with this one, I think, because it would most capture the special operations community. I've heard from a few Green Berets in particular that they didn't love UW being touched. But I think, though, UW faces a misunderstanding. It can mean be conflated with political warfare in its entirety. It can also evoke memories to resistance forces attaching satchel charges to bridges in World War II, which, as a start point, it does a disservice to UW. The term and the understanding misses the years-long investment in building networks, building relationships, building capacity that make those kinds of things even possible. I think also at the same time, confining UW as a capability that is likened to breaking glass in case of emergency neglects the benefit that an approach towards emphasizing resistance can have in competition. So the new term, or the term I proposed, support to resistance, does three things. One, it makes clearer the impact of unconventional warfare left of bang. By that I mean something that happens before warfare is declared, before we're in a state of war, it can still provide benefits. Two, I think it does a better job of integrating the activities underlying that mission, that operation, with other activities from other components of government that are also associated with resistance. And three, it's a more familiar term for our allies and partners, in particular European allies and partners who are familiar with the resistance concept and other activities associated with resistance. Final thing I would point out, support to resistance to me, just on a mere terminology point, is truer to the actual definition of UW that we have in joint publications and public law. So for those reasons, I think support to resistance does a good job of harnessing what is encapsulated by UW, but also explaining it more clearly.
Next is counterterrorism becomes terrorism disruption.
Yeah, so the goal here was to maintain the relevance of combating terrorists, but trying to avoid any biases from the last 20 years on the best way to do that. The National Defense Strategy, as an example, lists the priorities. We all know what they are: China, Russia, rogue states such as Iran and North Korea, and then counterterrorism or counter-violent extremist organization, VEO. In doing so, it calls the need to be able to maintain that CT pressure, but to do so more sustainably. The Irregular Warfare Annex to the NDS makes an even finer point by saying we need a more resource sustainable approach alongside the National Strategy for Counterterrorism, which directs use of all government tools and resources, not just kinetic, to be applied to CT. So terrorism disruption then allows for thinking more sustainably about what the military is being asked to do, not merely countering all terrorists, but disrupting those who have the clearest intent and capability to attack the U.S. and its vital interests. That as a framing principle for combating terrorists is more attainable, allows for approaches that are a bit more sustainable, and it complements a lot of other non-kinetic activities that are frequently associated with terrorism prevention or countering violent extremism.
On this session of JSOU Next, we're speaking with Kevin Bilms, policy analyst at OSD Policy, who on January 15th, 2021, published an editorial piece on the War on the Rocks website entitled, "What's in a Name? Reimagining Irregular Warfare Activities for Competition." Kevin and I are walking through his 7 points. The next one is you propose combining counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, which will in turn create resistance against subversion and coercion.
That's right. So this looked at doctrine for both counterinsurgency or COIN, as well as foreign internal defense, aka FID. FID in particular, and seeing a lot of overlap there. So FID, broadly defined, supporting host nations to protect society from a range of activities. Insurgency is named as one of them, along with subversion and a host of other activities involving the actual or credible threat or use of force, which I attempt to cover by coercion. Some may not fully appreciate the idea of coin being subsumed under a broader term, but I believe doing that helps to bring a lot of the skills and expertise that were incorporated in coin into a great power competition context, separating it from the brand of coin that we saw most prominently in Iraq and Afghanistan. So with subversion and coercion identified as challenges, I added resilience as a way to convey what our activities are meant to do, and that is to bolster our partners and allies' ability to overcome challenges to their sovereignty or threats to their society. These kinds of challenges can happen internal to their boundaries. They can also happen externally from an outside force. We know a number of cases where we can see that kind of coercion, that kind of aggression happening on a day-to-day basis across the globe. More broadly and at a higher level, I'm a personal believer in incorporating resilience into grand strategy. I know there's been some writing on that in the last year or so, especially during the COVID pandemic. And I think that emphasizing resilience and competition is an important way for a state to enhance their legitimacy, which in turn makes it places them in a better position to compete and maintain influence. And to me, those are the hallmarks of irregular warfare. The struggle for influence and legitimacy is even more relevant than ever now, which makes IW in turn even more relevant in competition.
So Kevin, we've already started to receive some questions. What I'll do is I'll have you talk about your next point, and then we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll go through the remainder of the points. So the next one is stabilization becomes security restoration.
Yeah, so here was a case that the existing term generates a lot of antibodies. Stabilization has come to be associated with broader nation building. And the truth is that shouldn't really be the case. Stabilization as a mission is supporting broader U.S. political objectives, economic objectives, humanitarian objectives. But we do need to be more deliberate in what the military is asked to do in support of those endeavors. So that's where I came to security restoration. I had a number of peers in the War on the Rocks editors were very helpful with fine-tuning this point. But the point of DoD's role in stabilization as part of an irregular warfare mission is exactly that. It's to restore security in a fragile environment so that diplomats, development experts, local population leaders can find the long-term solution. That second part, the longer-term objective, that's not DoD's responsibility, but can certainly support it. In this way, at the same time, that doesn't mean that DoD is asked to restore security everywhere. Far from that. But instead, where it's determined to be in the United States' interest, some of those I mentioned earlier, this makes sure that DoD's role is scoped properly.
Okay, so looking at a couple of the questions, we have a couple of anonymous attendees who've proposed questions. The first is, I believe coming from a CT background will seriously bias leadership on GPC. Other names are being used for special operations. We can't simply relabel things. We also need the experience of individuals who've seen GPC in the past forums. Turning the comment into a question, how will someone who has limited training in the breadth of GPC systematically overcome their lack of training and the fact that their education is in counterterrorism and international affairs? How can people who have learned one way maybe embrace some of the ideas you've proposed?
So I think some of the answer to that is in adjusting professional military education and other professional curricula. I take completely the point that we're moving from a focus on counterterrorism and quote unquote lower intensity conflict towards this state of great power competition. But I think the risk in looking too far towards the high-end aspects of great power struggles presupposes the conflict and neglects all that space that happens well before shots are fired. And that's where I think irregular warfare and emphasizing a lot of the distinct missions and operations and activities associated with it provides value. I think additionally, this study on broader irregular warfare beyond just CT is meant to point out that there are a number of other missions and skill sets that, because so much focus was given to CT, that some others were not prioritized in the same way. And this was meant to point that out. Some activities like unconventional warfare, like FID, like our military information support operations, which we'll get to in a moment, those are highly, highly relevant for competition against state adversaries as well as non-state actors.
We'll go one more question and we'll go back to your points. David Knoll asked the question, China has adopted a modern conventionally integrated IW concept that they're employing across the competition continuum and trying to get the joint staff or services to buy into the utility of irregular warfare in GPC. How useful is it to look at Chinese definitions? Did you look at any other definitions, or was this more focused on US doctrine?
This was more focused on U.S. doctrine, but that question is spot on. The Chinese have developed a way to utilize all their resources at their disposal in creative and unorthodox ways to achieve their objectives without resorting to war. It's a common phrase everyone likes to reuse from Sun Tzu, to win without fighting. And that certainly does seem to be guiding a lot of their approach. My attempt here to keep this focus on irregular warfare was meant to look at these distinct levers of power, but it is certainly a good question and a good comment that we should be looking to incorporate all aspects of U.S. power in a similar way, but not merely to react to adversarial provocations, but also to be proactive and seize the tempo and conditions and set the conditions of competition.
For our listeners, thanks for those questions. Keep typing them into the Q&A and John will forward them and I'll get them asked to Kevin. We've left some time at the end to answer your questions and questions maybe you haven't even thought of yet. The next bullet that you write in your article is of particular interest to myself and lots of people at JSOU today. We're actually doing a curriculum workshop. Military Information Support Operations, or MISO, becomes Military Information and Influence Operations. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so a subtle shift, but I thought it was an important one to try and add a different spin to a debate that really has captured the PSYOP community for close to a decade. It seems like every couple of years, this skill set shifts from being called psychological operations, information operations, military information support operations, and any other number of similar terms. But they're all trying to get at the same thing, and that's the art of providing select information to influence foreign audiences. The influence word is important. Some have said the military does not do influence, but the joint publication for MISO references influence 27 times. And the intent behind any kind of information is to pass ideas and try to influence people's objectives, motives, and reasoning. So it seemed to be appropriate to work influence into the title instead of try to work around it. Military information and influence operations, just as a job of pointing out that the military has a role in this space. I think yourself and a great number of others certainly would agree to that. And that happens in both competition and conflict alike, whether it's trying to persuade or lead opposing militaries to believe a certain position or capability, certain foreign government leaders to think a way about a decision or a course of action, or foreign population centers a range of audiences. This happens in both peace and war. It happens alongside diplomatic and other U.S. government entities as well. I agree to an extent with the community who thinks that psyops can have misleading connotations or otherwise be distracting. When you think of 1960s era brainwashing, propaganda, those other kinds of activities. I think influence is, by comparison, less distracting, and that's why I suggested going with that instead. I'll also cover briefly here that an enabling activity as currently defined for irregular warfare is cyberspace operation. To me, that is a vague term that justifies basically any activity in cyberspace, whether it is informational activity operation, or whether it is what you might consider to be more traditional warfare activities. Targeting C2 nodes or adversary networks. Those could be activities that more conventionally aligned and more traditional aspects of military power than looking to influence populations. So for the sake of this exercise, I suggested that it was appropriate to treat cyberspace as an operating environment, not unlike the air, the land, the sea, and to discard use of the term cyberspace operation because it doesn't really add anything to IW.
So this next one's a little different because in some of your previous points, you changed a term or you combined terms. This one, you kind of blended terms together. You blend counter threat networks and counter threat finance into something that you call malign network disruption. Explain this one for us.
Yeah, so this is an area where I think there's real growth in competition. But I think that growth can come from just looking at our capabilities a little differently. So counter threat networks, CTN, counter threat finance, CTF are highly relevant for competition, but I think they are too often kind of binned in those niche tools that go after terrorists, counter narcotics missions, or transnational organized crime. But if they were applied or conceptualized in a way to present options against adversary proxy groups, private military contractors, maybe some state-owned enterprises who are engaging in illicit, illegal activity at a state's behest, that could pull these capabilities forward to the competitive landscape. And in doing so, that provides more options in competition, more options before conflict, and opportunities to uphold and maintain international laws and norms, while at the same time imposing costs on malign activities. So to bring this back to the article at a higher level, this is an attempt to take the range of activities that we have and try and look at them in a different lens and show how we can use these differently and potentially arrive at significant benefits.
Finally, in your article, you would merge civil military operations and another area that I'm involved in here at JSOU, security cooperation, into what you call security partner engagement. Tell us why.
Yeah, so this was an area where I think civ-mil operations and security cooperation, I think they can be significant force multipliers for competition, but they tend to be misunderstood or not fully appreciated. Security cooperation, to me, can mean virtually anything you do with a security partner, and a lot of times that might limit itself at foreign military sales. To me, looking at this from an irregular warfare standpoint, these activities are very relevant and their definitions are very relevant. When you think about influence and legitimacy as being major objectives, prioritizing those relationships and partnerships should be front and center in any meaningful approach. not just to have somebody you can call in the event of conflict, but for all the benefits that happened well before then. So full disclosure, this was the hardest term to redefine. It took me going back and forth several times with a number of my teammates and colleagues, probably more than they cared to personally, as well as the War on the Rocks editing team. But one constant that I was going through was U.S. Cyber Command's concept of persistent engagement in the cyber domain, where they believe that by engaging forward, they can forestall adversarial advances. And I thought that was very applicable in a struggle for influence and legitimacy, where we could potentially confront ourselves with adversaries seeking to sow fissures in existing alliances and partnerships, or potentially try and advance their own alliances and partnerships in at our expense. So looking at security partner engagement was my way to square the circle of that problem, and to me would fit in nicely with last fall's guidance of for development of alliances and partnerships that came out of DoD to inform how we approach our hard-fought, hard-earned partners and allies, a significant advantage that we have in competition.
So you spent a lot of time and effort on this article. You propose these 7 changes to these areas. For what purpose? What do you think that this will accomplish?
Yeah, so I hoped that it would, and I think it already has caused some people to think differently about applying existing capabilities and expertise. And in this particular instance, irregular warfare, for the challenges that we face today. In some cases, we may need to relearn capabilities that we had. We may need to develop new capabilities. But in a lot of cases, we have existing tools that can be adapted for this new competitive environment that we face, and help us to be more agile, better connected, and hopefully more successful as well. A second idea that I wanted this article to provide is that DoD can be an important supporter and contributor in competition before conflict, and accomplish that in a way that allows it to do more apart from preparing for the high-end war. I believe a recent statement from the Commandant of the Marine Corps is actually a case in point for this approach. I think it's important also to note that irregular warfare shouldn't be discarded or passed over in this new era, but pointing out that a lot of our capabilities and expertise are very relevant now, and help ensure that conditions remain favorable if we ever need to enter a state of conflict.
So I'm going to go to some of the questions. And again, continue to please send them in the Q&A. We've got several. Kaylee B wrote a question, and you kind of alluded to this. We look at irregular warfare as some people see it as a soft thing due to kind of how it's been portrayed. Can you talk a little bit about the role that conventional forces play in irregular warfare?
So I think the conventional forces are able to conduct a whole range of irregular warfare missions. And we saw that over the past 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Conventional forces can and are well able to lead a lot of these activities. Looking at the existing doctrine, I think the only two that are truly soft specific would be unconventional warfare. So hopefully the Green Berets are not upset at me anymore. And some aspect of MISO. But I think this gets to another point that irregular warfare is frequently conflated as only belonging to soft. And truthfully, it's just a different framework to look at approaching state of competition with adversaries whose interests do not align with our own, rather than emphasizing military domination, instead going towards increasing influence and legitimacy. That's not to say that conventional forces should completely retrain everything they do, but that looking at their day-to-day activities in competition through an irregular lens could provide significant benefits.
So I have one from an anonymous attendee, and this is what I think makes Think JSOU interesting, is you have a chance to ask a question to the author, and this anonymous attendee is making a knowledge claim to you. Why are you approaching this from a textbook definition point of view? What is your experience with the data and practice of the different activities that have actually occurred outside of CT? So I love it when readers will go back and say, where are you coming from? What's your basis for this knowledge claim you're making? And I think it's great you're here, because I think you're the perfect person to write this article.
Yeah, so my predominant background has been in CT, as I think most who entered government in the last 15 or so years, most did have at least one rotation related to counterterrorism. I think my past 2 years in SOLIC, where I provide policy oversight for a number of authorities on behalf of ASD SOLIC, that look at soft activities associated with irregular warfare, I've become certainly more operationally familiar with the other activities within irregular warfare. And having become more acquainted with how SOF attempts to apply those other activities, but also being in the position where we are trying to change the discussion and change the discourse on how SOF fits into competition, allowed me to draw on some of my direct personal experience, as well as see what is currently happening in this space and how to potentially move it forward.
So Leah Treppel has kind of a different question for you, maybe something that'll take you out of the direct article, but maybe an application or just your opinion. Are there some geographic regions that might surprise us based on what you've written? She's an Arctic specialist, and she's worried that we tend to pattern based on our past, as opposed to adopting to proactive, longer time frame like our adversaries. So when we look at the Arctic, are we looking to our past in the ideas you proposed?
So I'm not familiar enough with the Arctic that perhaps I should be. So I don't think I have any specific knowledge or wisdom to pass on that topic. But I do think we can look at past approaches that our adversaries have taken. You think of little green men showing up in Crimea as an example. You think of island building or populating random geographic features as a means to exert area control. And I think those are important to look at and understand what the indicators were, what the vulnerabilities are to those approaches, and for future emerging landscapes such as the Arctic, potentially causing a question or discussion about options that allow you to look at the problem differently and come up with solutions that are better tailored.
And Megan Cat asks, aside from considering potential terminology changes, how is the department currently working towards institutionalizing irregular warfare within the joint force, including both within SOF and conventional forces? How are you measuring progress? So maybe a little more about kind of your day-to-day, but I'm sure that your normal work informed this article.
Yeah, so that is a lot of our day-to-day, and I don't want to go too much into the details on that, but the Irregular Warfare Annex to the National Defense Strategy, as with any appropriate strategy, does have an implementation plan, and it is looking at, and one of the distinct efforts that is underpinning that is exactly what was described, institutionalizing IW across the joint force. Some of that, which this article tried to be informed on, but also in turn potentially inform, is looking at the existing litany of directives, guidances, issuances, joint publication, figuring out how those remain relevant, or if they are not currently relevant in their current form, bringing them there. And then I mentioned earlier, I think in response to an earlier question, ensuring that PME, professional military education, is able to teach practitioners the relevant skill sets and expertise to be knowledgeable, effective in this space. Those will be institutional for institutionalizing and also critical, which JSOU here and some of the other components of the broader NDU network, I think will play a significant role.
So we still have time if you want to add your questions. We still got a couple in our Q&A, but if you still have a question, please write it into the Q&A, and I'll give it to Kevin like I have been. So someone has given me a very interesting question. So hold on, Kevin, here it comes. Anonymous attendee writes, in reference to i.e. Emil Simpson et al., is it not dangerous to picture influence as a non-kinetic task? Does it not have merit to consider an influence continuum from very non-kinetic towards the use of lethal force? Would this model not have merit to tie kinetic operations to desired political effects and hence help to restore the strategy bridge? So that you can pull any question you want out of that, Kevin. It's all up to you. I think your article attempts to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that influence is not exclusively non-kinetic is certainly a fascinating one. I don't want to get too far away from the article and exploring that path, but I certainly think that's a very important and very sage point that was raised.
So Kevin, you've had a bunch of questions. We still have time for one or two more if you want to chat it in, put it in the Q&A. But I have a question, Kevin. What has been one of the most interesting responses? Have you had any interesting, you're kind of surprised by the reaction or what someone has asked you?
So I've had a few people say that something along the lines of, I didn't think a happy to glad article would be worth reading, but then I read it and sent it along to my network. So I appreciated comments like that. I think that points to an appreciation for what I was trying to do by just teasing out some of the goodness that is in IW and helping to look at it through a different lens. I also think it's been great to see a number of folks in this space who I admire, whose work I cite all the time, in turn think that this is worth sharing to their network and believing that it was compelling. What I think has been most rewarding, and I think War on the Rocks was a valuable platform for doing, was that a number of skeptics to irregular warfare read this and basically said something along the lines of, hey, you nailed it, some very useful thought for thinking about. And as I mentioned a couple of times, that's really what I wanted to achieve here. Irregular warfare has a lot of utility for competition. There are a lot of people who don't quite see it that way or haven't yet, but this kind of writing and these kinds of discussions will help people to come around and figure out how to move forward together, incorporating this alongside a whole range of capabilities that we have.
I would imagine in your job and in your role, you're a busy person. Why were you compelled to write this article? I kind of set that up at the beginning. We've had a conversation, but what did you hope to achieve, and do you think you've achieved it?
So as I mentioned at one point, I like doing this kind of extracurricular writing because it helps me kind of in a blue ocean environment think about some issues that are free from the noise of the day-to-day work, that are free from existing doctrine, and try to make more sense of it. So that's something that I try to bring to whenever I write anything in my free time. Which is usually nights and weekends, but certainly what I tried to do here. And I forget if there was a second part to that question. Whether or not I achieved it, I don't know. I think it's an ongoing dialogue. I think getting the level of interest and getting folks like yourself who wanted to talk to me about it, I think those are good measures of performance. I guess the ultimate measure of effectiveness would be down the line. But I think we're making good progress in this discussion.
So Kevin, we really appreciate here at Think JSOU you spending some time with us to talk about your War on the Rocks article. Do you have any final thoughts for the audience?
No, I'm very thankful to you, thankful to JSOU, thankful to the audience for the questions and for bearing with us. These technical issues still persist even as we've been in this unusual environment for a while. I'm really grateful for the time, the discussion, and what else we're able to accomplish. So thanks so much.
Hey, Kevin, so on behalf of over the 100 participants of today's JSOU Next presentation, as well as the faculty and staff of JSOU, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, as well as the great audience. For all of our audience members, please remember and to continue to look for the next JSOU Next presentation. Thank you for your time.